This is a little talk that I decided to give on valve timing, and I don't really have time here to go too deep into all of it, but I'm going to cover it as much of it as I can, and I really appreciate the feedback I'm getting on some of these. There was one guy that was looking at one of my classroom videos the other day, was laughing at how much stuff I had in my pocket of my uniform shirt. And the funny thing about it was people would see all that stuff in my pocket and they would think that all of those things were pins. Well, there was a pin and a Sharpie and a magnet and a laser and a pocket screwdriver and just a bunch of different tools in there. And it's always seemed to me like the people that were laughing about the stuff I carried in my pocket were the same people that wanted to borrow my pocket flashlight or my pocket screwdriver sometimes because they didn't have one and they needed it. Well, whenever it comes to timing, there's ignition timing and there's valve timing. And most of you guys that have been out there for a while in the field understand the importance of both of those. Back in the old model the pickup that my dad was driving when he met my mom, there's a spark advance handle over here, and then there's a hand throttle. Remember, if you ever driven an old tractor, you might notice they've still got a hand throttle on them. Ignition switch, gas shutoff valve, choke and gas adjusted valve. On these, the gas tank was mounted right in front of the windshield, and the gasoline gravity fed down to the carburetor. And if you were low on gas and started up a hill, the car would quit because the gas wasn't being able to gravity feed to the carburetor, and you might have to turn around and back up the hill so you could get up the hill. But that's basically what it was. If anybody ever tried to turn the crank on the front of a car to start the engine without retarding the timing, and it kicks back and break your arm. So thankfully we don't have to fool with all that anymore. Back in the day, people had to have a lot of common sense just to drive a vehicle. Now, I knew about this one guy when he was a little kid that figured out that he could get his daddy's car started by putting it in gear and turning on the key and jumping on the wheel, the spokes of the wheel, and spinning it and getting it started. Of course, it had to be up off the ground a little bit, but he had a way of doing that too. And he was driving it all over the place back in the days of these cars right here. But the simple fact is, if you let the timing belt decide on its own, and I would tell customers and people this, if you let the timing belt decide on its own when it's time for replacement, it can have devastating results. It won't always, depending on the vehicle you got. The lady that lives over here close to me, she's got a little Mitsubishi Galant, and I was telling her one day, I said, you better take that thing over to this local shop. I knew that she used to shop over and have that timing belt replaced because it's time for that. And you'll be sorry if you don't, because those cars tend to bend valves and you got to pull the heads and all that kind of stuff. But freewheeling, free spinning, and interference engines, you can basically, if you're looking at the shop manual and it tells you to be careful where the pistons are when you're putting the head on and all this kind of thing, then you can have a pretty good idea this is an interference engine. Some of the engines we know are not interference engine, but typically if it's got a timing chain, even if it's an old V8, if it jumps time bad enough on one of the old V8 engines, it can bend valves because those are interference engines. Whenever Ford Escort first came out in the real early 80s, they were interference engines, and some of them, there was actually a program on the early Escorts where they would replace the pull the head off and fix any bent valves and all. And then they flat cut the pistons to keep the valves from making contact with them from 83 on. They didn't have any more issues with that. But Toyota Camrys were good engines to not bend valves. The little 2.4 in the Dodge Stratus and all, those were free spinning engines. But Kias and Mitsubishis typically aren't, and there's others. Some of your other Asian makes. There was a girl that came in one time that wanted some kind of work done on her little Isuzu Trooper or whatever it was. I can't remember. It was some one of those cars along that line. Might not have been an Isuzu, but it was one that I knew was an interference engine. And the timing belt, I could hear it slapping the cover. And we did the other work she wanted done, and I said, you need to get this timing belt replaced. I can get a timing belt from the parts store. I can have a student put one on there for you right away. She says, okay. She was a sort of goofy, And she just drove away and never thought about coming back until a month later, and she told me this after the fact. She was turning in at Walmart and it quit, and it cost her $1,500 to get that thing fixed because it jumped time being every valve in it. And I had warned her about that, but she didn't take it seriously. It's something that needs to be taken seriously. Now here's one right here, an email I got from a subscriber to the website I used to use. My wife and I were driving to Florida from North Carolina when our 2004 Kia Rio broke down. The timing belt broke. Subsequently, the entire engine needs to be replaced. We still owe $7,000 on the Kia. My question is, would you advise sinking another $3,000 into a Kia with 90,000 miles? See, Kia recommends the timing belt be replaced at 60,000 mile intervals on non-California vehicles. I'm not sure why California vehicles require anything different than that, but the point is they went 30,000 miles past when they should have had their timing belt replaced and just kept on driving it. That's like some of these people, when you ask them when was the last time you had an oil change, and they'll say, well, it was 8 or 10,000 miles ago, but I don't even know why it's a problem because my car's still running just fine. I never really understood that line of thinking. You know, they feel like when it starts running bad, I'll have the oil changed. You know, but I've seen people do that. Now, pistons and valves are doing a really delicate time dance. Doesn't happen by accident. Furthermore, if the timing, you know, I told that, well, I'll tell you the story about the other Toyota Camry in a minute. But the camshafts always spin at 50% of crankshaft speed, and the camshafts are not an easy spin. They're operating on spring-loaded valves. That's why some of the engines have got scissor gears, which will be like a couple of gears that are cut, you know, that are made together with a spring in between them, and it's loaded, so that spring is always keeping pressure on those teeth. Toyota Camrys are like that. Lexus is like that. You know, the Toyota Camrys, the little 2.2s, have got two camshafts, but they've only got one sprocket out here outside, but they got another sprocket inside that drives those two camshafts, and they turn in opposite directions. Well, the sprockets inside there, that the metal teeth, one of them got scissor gears. You don't put a 6mm bolt in there and tighten it down to keep those scissor gears from coming unloaded, and you just put it back together without the scissor gears being loaded. You'll hear a brrrr noise come from under the valve cover. And it's not that hard to reload those scissor gears and put them back in there. But those little gears have got a timing mark, so they got to be put back together. You can't just throw them back in there any kind of way. Everybody knows that. It's worked on car very much. How they're driven, though, is tailored for the fact that these camshaft, anybody that's ever put a wrench on a camshaft and turned it will show you that it bounce, you know, every time it opens and closes the valves. It's basically got a lot of tendency to try to rattle if you've got any kind of lash in those gears whatsoever. Earlier, Ford 2.8 liters had a phenolic gear that was made. It would bust sometimes, but they had it phenolic so it wouldn't make a lot of noise. The Chevy 2.2 four-cylinder cast iron ones, they had a gear like that. It was phenolic. The Volkswagen Bugs had a camshaft, had like 11 different grinds. It had a 0 and then a 0 and then a +1 through 5s and a -1 through 5, which were slightly different gear slants, so that you picked the one. You had to set that thing up when you were building the engine, so there was absolutely no lash at all. If there was lash, so that those gears had a little bit of slop there, whenever the camshaft was working, it would wind up making a lot of racket that had to be taken care of by pulling it back apart and replacing the camshaft with one that had a different slant, so there was no lash on the gears. But anytime you've got gear-driven camshaft, there has to be some measure taken to keep it from making noise. All right, so when a piston's going down, which two of the four strokes might be in progress? Well, these right here, I put this together one time for my students on that. You know, if it's going down, it's going to be an intake or a power stroke, and if it's going up, it's going to be an exhaust stroke or a compression stroke. That's not complicated. All right. Overhead cam versus overhead valve. Now, why they call them overhead valve, I've never understood, because all of the valves are overhead. The only thing that had any valve that wasn't overhead were your old flathead engines like the Ford used to have, or like a Briggs & Stratton lawnmower engine that's got valves in the block, you know. Those are, you know, but they call overhead valve versus overhead cam. All the valves are overhead, you know. But typically overhead cam engines, will have 4 valves per cylinder. Now, one of the ones that was very ingeniously put together, I thought, was the little PT Cruiser engines, because they just had a whole bunch of lobes on one camshaft, but they had 4 valves per cylinder. That doggone thing just works really smooth for that. But anyway, the camshaft in the block is what I like. The pickup truck that I drive is an F-150 that's got the 4.2 liter engine in it, and it has got that engine platform, the same basic engine family, has been around since 1979. The transmission that's in that truck's 4R70W, and it's basically the same as the old AOD that came out in '79. So that engine and transmission platform in the truck that I drive has been around, for a very long time. And typically when you get one that's been around that long, they have all the bugs worked out of it, and you can get a lot of miles out of the engine and the transmission without a whole lot of trouble. The only parts of my truck that have given any trouble at all are like the instrument panel. Was pulling the battery down one time, and also the fuse panel junction box under there, which is made in China. I had some trouble with that. All right, so the overhead cam styles, there are more than this, are basically going to be laid out like this, with a stacked gear down here and camshaft going up here, and then they've got these right here that are dual overhead cams, and they're going to have this one driving that one, which changed to that one. This is vaguely similar to the one on the Lexus. Has actually got them geared together under the valve cover with just a single gear on the outside, and the Lexus 4-liter. And then this one here is basically a dual overhead cam. I didn't picture them all, but you get the point. Whenever you're doing a water pump, this is the water pump on this one. Whenever you're doing a water pump, you need to be making sure, if you're having to pull all that timing cover off, or if the timing belt jumps teeth, or if it jumps or whatever, you need to be feeling of all of those, the idlers, and a lot of the times the bearings will die in the tensioner, and you'll find balls laying all down in there and everything. Furthermore, it's really important when you're scraping gaskets and whatnot, whenever you're doing work so the timing cover area is exposed, that you don't leave any little pieces of gasket laying around up in there. You need to blow all that out with your air, because whenever that thing's running, if a piece of gasket material falls down and it gets on the side of the belt, whenever it's going, whenever the gear is pulling the belt, it can actually ride around and cause that timing belt to jump. A lot of times we don't think about that, but I've actually seen one come back that was timed perfectly when it left, and it came back with low engine vacuum and running rich, because when they scraped the gasket, they let gasket material fall down in there, and it came back and it was several teeth out of time. That was the only explanation that would have worked for that, because there was gasket material curling off, when you're scraping it. You got to watch where that stuff goes, because it can do more damage than you think. All right. Driving a camshaft requires a connection. This right here, this set right here, some people take this, they replace this with this. Now that's okay, but if they're not set up right, that can be noisy as all get out. And the reason this works the way it does is because you're adding some more gears, which, you're turning this one this way, these are turning the other way, and that makes the one turn the way it's supposed to go. But that's the replacement for that for some of the hot rodders. If you got one that's got all kinds of gears that have to be timed on it, balance shafts and all that sort of stuff, you better know how to do that and pay attention to those marks. See, this one here's got a mark there, it's got a mark there, it's got a mark there. You gotta watch all of those. And this one right here, that looks like one of those that on the old cast iron 4-cylinder Chevrolet that I'm thinking about from the mid-'80s. And then of course you got these right here. Now, interestingly enough, I used to run into problems on Escorts, Ford Escorts, that would have, if you watch the tachometer needle, it would go boom, 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 boom. It would act almost like you had, how you'll have a random misfire because of a spark plug that's gapped a little too close, or because it's fouled. I'd seen those Escorts doing that, and I would fight with those things trying to figure out what was wrong with them, making them, do that. And I have gone so far, I'd put a distributor on a couple of them, and it seemed to not consistently fix them. And when I finally found out what was going on with those Escorts, the timing belt was just a little bit loose. And when I was tightening the timing belt up just a little bit, you don't tighten the timing belt like you do an alternator belt. And I'll show you what's going on there in a minute. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the simple fact is, the timing belt being a little bit loose on one of those escorts, you can't take this to the bank on every car, but you know the camshaft drove the distributor on those cars. And I wasn't clear as crystal as to why this thing was misfiring because of a loose timing belt. But I do know that putting a distributor on it would seem like it fixed it for a little bit, and then it would go back to doing it again. And when I started tightening the timing belt, I started taking care of these problems. It's a pretty interesting set of circumstances. Now, variable valve timing, there's different ways that it happens. You know, this center part right here, this vane is connected to the camshaft, and this bolts to the sprocket is outside. So what you're basically doing is you're changing the relationship between the sprocket and the camshaft. And the first ones I ever worked on that had variable cam timing were 95 Ford Contours, and they only had it on the exhaust camshaft to close the valves a little early, leave some exhaust gas in there to combat oxides of nitrogen, which basically would, in so doing, they eliminated EGR. Now, some of your 626 Mazdas had basically that same engine in them. But this right here is on a 3.9 Ford, and you can basically see how this part is bolted to the camshaft and this outside part is driven by the sprocket. And so you'll have a solenoid that is putting oil on the, putting oil pressure in there. See how those vanes have got those seals? It puts oil pressure in there to change that, and they're spring loaded to their default. Your big Ford 5.4s are set up with that kind of thing. They got those variable valve timings, and anybody that's ever been in this business very long has worked on some of those 3-valve 5.4s, where you had to replace the, they have a little kit. I think some of your engine manufacturers will basically have a little kit where they put little wedges in there so that the variable valve timing goes away, because it has a tendency on some vehicles to be problematic, on others not so much. But to change the valve timing on the fly, that's what I was talking about a minute ago. Now, what I started to say, the Contours had a helical cut gear, and when you move a helical cut gear like this, it moves. And so they had a helical cut gear, and the oil pistons was made to move that helical cut gear, and that's how it did that one. It was set up kind of like this, and of course this is like the other ones. Vane gears, ball ramp gears. There's some ball ramp gears too, but I didn't have a, and they can be mechanical if they're done the right way. They have these balls running out, but that's something that I've never really had to work on, but if you do research, you'll see those. Now, on your timing chains, a double roller chain tends to be a little noisier, but it doesn't stretch the way these chains here do. Now, these laminated chains, and I've done a zillion of those, these almost never need to be replaced, but these tend to stretch. I saw an extreme case on a Dodge pickup, like a 78 half-ton Dodge pickup, when I was working down in Texas, and that thing had low engine vacuum, low power. It was dreadful, and whenever you can tell if the timing chain has stretched in one of the old V8s by turning it in the direction that it goes, stopping it on 0 degrees top dead center, and then watch your rotor in your distributor while you're turning the crankshaft backwards. And the instant the rotor, you just turn it real slow, and while the instant the rotor starts to move, you look and see how many degrees you turned your crankshaft, and that's going to tell you how much timing chain stretch you got. If you're getting much over 10 degrees timing chain stretch, you got some, you need to replace the timing chain. Now, the old aluminum and plastic gears didn't tend to stretch that chain as bad, but when they wore out, they would shell off pieces of plastic. I talked about that in a previous video, and messed up my brother's 71 Thunderbird because plastic came off and got in the oil pump, locked it up, and so on and so forth. All right, gears, belts, and chains. Benefits of a timing belt over a chain is that you just put seals here and you snake that belt around there, and you don't have to oil any of this. Now, on the timing chain, all of this has got to be oiled. And I've groused about this before, but these people have put the water pump in there so that it's driven by the timing chain. Maybe they don't have room to do anything else. The Ford Flex engine is like that. And the way those happen is whenever the water pump fails and starts leaking, it fills the crankcase up with water. Now, Dodge 2.7 liters, you know, the Dodge Chrysler one, to their credit, they at least had it so that whenever that water pump failed, the water would leak outside the engine and it wouldn't leak into the oil. But it's easier to replace a timing belt typically. It doesn't need all those stupid nylon sliders and all that. Typically, when you, and if the longer people go without changing their oil, and the more prone they are to drive a long way and let their engine get sludged up, the more they're going to have trouble with variable valve timing and a whole host of other things. These pistons right here on this particular kind are driven by oil pressure. All right, and so chains can be a good thing though. They usually last the life of the vehicle. Most timing belts don't. Although some timing belts have got a 100,000 mile interval, and some timing belts, and I mentioned that on the previous slide, are actually swimming in oil. They basically got them sealed up in there, and they've got oil in there because it causes less drag and it helps with fuel economy and all that kind of stuff. I don't really like that idea, but I think Volkswagen does that with some of theirs, and some of the others might too. Timing belts fail if something they drive locks up, water pump, idler pulley, so on. If it has a chain, it'll bend the valve. If it's a belted Kia or a Mitsubishi, it'll bend the valve. If it's a belted Toyota or a Ford, it's usually free spinning. You got to make sure you know the truth about the engine. Don't ever turn it backwards, because if you turn it backwards, even if it's got a timing chain, like when you're taking the truck out of the vehicle, or the engine out of a vehicle, if you turn it the wrong way, remember when you're standing in front of the vehicle looking at that engine, it's going to be turning clockwise. If you're sitting in the seat looking at the back of the engine, it's turning counterclockwise. Make sure you turn it the way it runs. It's never a good idea to turn an engine backwards. It's just not. So you're asking for trouble if you do that. All right, so replacing the belt when it hasn't jumped time, believe it or not, I have seen some shops that don't even look at timing marks. And they just don't move anything when they take it apart, and they try to put it back together with the belts exactly in the same spot. They may make little Sharpie marks on the gears and all that, and so on and so forth. But that is a wacky way to do that. I have never in my life tried to put a timing belt on without finding the timing marks. I'm always wanting to know where the timing marks are. Sometimes you can just look at them and figure it out. As a matter of fact, most of the time you could. I did that for a long time. But I have seen people though, on the 4-cylinder engine, when you're putting the timing belt in there, if you got the camshafts like they're supposed to be, and the ones like the Contour engine I was talking about, got the slots on the back of the camshaft, and Volkswagen Rabbits, the old diesel Rabbits and all did too, and also the gas burner Rabbits, they had a slot on the back of the camshaft, so you put a little tool in there to hold that camshaft perfectly. And the whole thing is to put the camshaft exactly where it's supposed to be. The gear on those doesn't even have a keyway. It basically just tightens up with a flat surface and a flat washer. I always thought that was kind of dicey, like it might slip or something. But the way they got it set up, apparently it doesn't. Long and the short of it is, here you are having to know, like on some of these engines you got nowadays, like on some of the Ford Escapes, you basically have got a little hole in the side of the block where you put a pin in there, and it drops into a little slot on the crankshaft to locate the crankshaft. On some of your Crown Victorias and those big V8s that Ford it has on some of them, you got a tool that holds the crankshaft exactly where it's supposed to be, and then you got other tools that hold the camshaft where they're supposed to be while you lock everything down. You're seeing more and more of these engines built without timing marks, but you got to have special tools usually, unless you're extremely familiar with the engine. Now this one right here is a 4-liter. Now the 4 liters Ford is the 4-liter Ford engine is what this is, and it's very interesting because it's got a camshaft on the back of the right head and on the front of the left head, and then it's got a jack shaft running through the middle of it. So the crankshaft spins the jack shaft, and the jack shaft drives both camshafts and all. But there's no timing marks on this one. You got these special tools that you can buy. They got a whole kit that's got cam tools you can buy. It doesn't cost very much now. You got to hold that thing in place with this, and this right here holds the reason this is here is so it holds the gear and the timing chain while you're taking that bolt out. Now the one on the back of the passenger side head is left hand thread, so you got to make sure that you know which one you're spinning off. I always have to think about that to make sure I'm not lying about that. I think the one on the driver's side front of the cam is right-hand thread, and the one on the other one is left-hand thread. And this works better if you got the motor out, but they have special tools for you doing it with it in the vehicle. But you got to tighten this down with these pins going into the holes in that gear to keep you from putting pressure on that gear and tensioner and all when you're taking that bolt loose, so you can move that gear freely. This holds the camshaft. It's got a slot that will only, it's an offset slot, and it holds the camshaft while you're locking this down where it's supposed to go. Now, whenever you're tightening that jack shaft, there's got to be somebody holding the other side of that. When you're tightening that, there's basically, it's a torque to yield boat, and that is a very, very difficult job to try to do by yourself. And I was at my buddy's shop out here when he was redoing the timing chains on one of those, and he was buckling that down. He's got one of them fancy, that's not it, but he's got one of those fancy snap-on torque wrenches that will tell you when you've turned it 90 degrees and all that. But anyway, there was him and his two employees working on that. Then there are tensioners, and I showed this the other day on another one, are basically, some of them are, this one here doesn't have the ratchet in it, for that 99 Avalon, I mean not Avalon, but Oldsmobile, the last one they made, whatever it was. It's really something that old-timers disease makes you forget names. Anyway, this one right here was a Dodge truck. And I'll tell you what happened. They had tensioner house just going crazy. That's a brand new tensioner, a new timing chain and all that. Now this one here is not moving so much, but that one was moving all over the place. And the problem was, the guy that did that, basically, you know how when you get these new tensioners out of the box, they got foil on the back of them? Well, he bolted that tensioner up without taking the foil off the back of the tensioner, and it couldn't get any oil pressure, so it was just dancing in and out. Alright, now this right here was on a Honda Passport, and that thing was making all kinds of a rattling noise. It hadn't jumped time, but obviously that thing is not supposed to be that easy to move. Okay, supposed to push that thing in, it's supposed to go in real slow with your vise and then put a pin in it. When you put it back in there, you pull your locking pin out after you got everything else like it's supposed to be, and it pushes against that tensioner. Some of them you actually have to cock them and then stick a pin in there and then pull it out whenever it's ready. Now this one right here, I don't have it where you can hear the sound on this, but this was a video that's on my YouTube channel. You can look it up. It's a noisy timing belt because it was tightened up too much. If you make some of them, they got round tooth timing belts and square tooth timing belts. And the round tooth timing belts, as I remember, are the ones that are prone to be noisy if you over tighten them. If you get them too tight, they'll make a noise when you're revving them up, and you have to loosen the timing belt just a little bit to make that noise go away. It almost sounds like you got a bearing or something going on there. But the student that put that timing belt in managed to pull that stunt. He tightened it up too much, and it was making all that racket. Pay attention to the marks. And see, this one here was put together wrong. I had to tell the guy that was working on it, that's not right, this has got to be here. He had to take it back down. This right here is for your cam sensor here. And now look at this one here. See this mark on this picture for the Toyota Camry? I did a little video on this earlier. That's where that mark is. That's a little teeny tiny mark. And you got to be paying attention to those marks real close. This is not a free spinning engine on this 03 Camry dual overhead cam with that timing chain. Here's one right here that I had actually, see that little mark right there on the cam cap on the 2.2 Camry? That mark is not the one you use. That one's the one you use. That one doesn't even look like it's right. That one looks like what you're supposed to be used. Anyway, so the trick that works when you're reinstalling a belt on a DOHC engine, you get some of these things, and because those camshafts like to move around, and that's a real drag. Alright, so make sure the marks line up each time. Start the engine, listen to the noise, route the wire harnesses right so they don't get cut. Pay particular attention to the crank sensor if it's routed near the belt. That's about the end of it. And I really, but there's a zillion, anybody that has done very much mechanic work at all has done lots and lots and lots of timing belt jobs and timing chain jobs and all that kind of thing. But you really got to pay attention to what you're doing and do the. Some people will take those long, like I was talking about one day on a previous video, those long on an interference engine, these big tie wraps, and they'll rest them on top of the pistons, and they'll turn it so that they know that all the pistons are halfway down. That's a good idea to keep it from getting valves bent. That's about all the time that I have today, and I really appreciate you guys watching the video, and I'll see you next time.